after Kevin's fascinating presentation there before coffee, we're going to have another really fascinating presentation now from Dr. Des Corrigan. I think I have interviewed Dr. Corrigan on pretty much every drug going. I think we started back with heroin, and certainly he was really fascinating on a program we did on headshop drugs, on what exactly was being sold, what exactly people were using. But as I'm sure you all know here, Dr. Des Corrigan chaired the National Advisory Committee on Drugs. He was also head of the School of Pharmacy in Trinity, where he always had specialist areas, if you like, were drugs of abuse, going back as far as 1968, the drugs that came in there, and also on natural medicinal products. So he's always fascinating to listen to on drugs and drug usage in Ireland. I would say he's the number one expert in the area here. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Des Corrigan.
Thanks very much, Corrigan. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Keelan. Keelan said she's interviewed me a number of times, and I have no scars at the end of the process. I can't say that about some other people who have interviewed me. But as ever, I'd like to thank Bernie and her board of directors for inviting me to be part of another important CAD occasion. I'm always glad to be involved. I've been involved for a long time with CAD, and I believe in what they're doing, particularly what they do with parents. And I think hopefully I'll touch on some of the reasons for that during the presentation. I find it a very strange experience to be standing up talking about drugs without talking about cannabis, because as a medicinal plant expert, cannabis is my thing. But having read about Project SAM over the years, and having had the pleasure of listening to Kevin yesterday and again this morning, there was very little I could add to what he's already said, other than to say from a personal perspective that I agree 100% with him in what he has said. And I only hope that those who are involved in drawing up the new national drug strategy might actually listen and learn from some of the things that he's had to tell us over the last couple of days. I won't say any more about that. So we face a particular challenge with a lot of different drugs. The legal drugs, alcohol, benzos, tobacco, cannabis, and all of the other illegal drugs. We also face a particular challenge with what are called new psychoactive substances. And new psychoactive substances, it's a legal term, which I have a particular fondness for, even though it's very clunky in normal, everyday conversation. And the reason for the fondness for it is that we devised it during the Irish presidency of the EU in 2004, when we were drawing up new EU legislation dealing with these substances. And we had to come up with a phrase that covered what was involved. Now I'm trying to figure out how I actually get this to work. I don't seem to be seem to have stuck here. Oh, sorry, it's not moving on my screen. So, okay. So I assumed it wasn't working on the screen. A variety of different names used for these substances. Sometimes designer drugs. A phrase that I absolutely hate, legal highs, because it implies to people that somehow these have been through some sort of regulatory approval process, which of course they haven't. Most people in this country would link them with the headshop drugs when they were sold as bath salts, as plant food, and as room deodorizers and herbal incenses. Nowadays, the weasel words on the packages that are being sold are research chemicals not for human consumption. And then you look at the blog on the website, they extol the virtues of the highs that you get from these and compare the highs to different other drugs. So what does the phrase new psychoactive substance actually mean? Well, psychoactive means anything that changes the way the brain works. So we're talking about something that causes hallucinations or change in motor functioning, usually stimulation, but sometimes depression. and which might or might not cause a state of psychological or physical addiction. And that distinction, that's a semi-legal definition coming from the European legislation. I mean, the psychological or physical addiction is essentially, from my perspective, meaningless. Sometimes people say because something isn't physically addictive, it's not harmful. And I make the point that the fact that something is psychologically addictive is the most harmful thing you can say about a particular chemical or a particular drug, because that's the one that's most difficult to deal with. Even the term new doesn't mean what I think it might mean. It doesn't mean new. Many of these, there's this sort of racist mythology around the place that there are these Chinese chemists skulking around their laboratories trying to think up new drugs to enslave Western youth. This isn't the truth. If you look at these dates, most of these new psychoactive substances, these drugs, and let's face it, they're drugs. I'm not going to call them new psychoactive substances anymore. It's too clunky. I'm going to call them drugs. This is what they are. They've been around for a long time. A lot of them are failed pharmaceutical drugs. And what these chemists are doing is they're trawling the scientific information that's already out there, picking out drugs that are not legally controlled in a lot of countries, and which might or might not affect the human brain. They don't know. Synthesizing them and then putting them on the market. And they haven't a bull's clue what they're going to do to human beings, because these drugs have never been properly tested, either in laboratory animals or in human beings. And my concern about all of these, the ones that have gone before and the ones that are here now and the ones that are yet to come, is that young people, and it's overwhelmingly young people, are guinea pigs in an experiment, the end result of which nobody knows. So new doesn't mean novel, being thought up for the first time. It means either newly available on the market or newly misused. They're a legacy of the head shop era. And most of the head shops have closed down, but they have left us a legacy, and not a very pleasant legacy. A whole range of different drugs. The synthetic cathinones, such as mephedrone, meow meow, or bubbles, also MDPV and PVP. A whole range of synthetic cannabis-like chemicals, synthetic cannabinoids. There's probably about 300 of them. Synthetic cocaine derivatives. A whole range of other things that might not be sold to what we call the bricks and mortar head shops, but they're being sold over the internet, over online head shops. Some of them are stimulants, acting like cocaine and amphetamine and crystal methamphetamine. Some of them are hallucinogenic, like LSD. Some of them, you could understand why people would market stimulants to young people who want the energy to dance for hours and end. But why they market synthetic heroin-like drugs like AH7921, like MT45, like acetyl fentanyl, is beyond me. Mexi, another hallucinogenic, and DMAR, stimulant that caused 18 deaths in Northern Ireland. So there's a range of different types of drugs being sold over the internet. The first of the big sellers for the head shop industry were the spice range of herbal smoking mixtures, which were then sprayed with a whole variety of synthetic cannabinoids. And I put up some of the names of the chemicals just to make the point that a lot of people, when they saw these names, were frightened of them because they weren't something that they were used to dealing with. They were used to dealing with cannabis, with ecstasy, with LSD, with heroin, with cocaine. And these were all strange, new names, what appear to be new drugs. And people were frightened about it. Or as in the words of the sociologists, they were disempowered and felt that they weren't able to cope and deal with these. And nothing could be further from the truth. So some of the more recent ones are things like Chronic and Jamaica Gold, and particularly the Bonsai range of mixtures, of smoking mixtures. Now, a lot of these herbal materials you wouldn't be worried about, apart from the fact that it's not a good idea to be inhaling burning leaf material of whatever variety it is. But you wouldn't be worried about things like marshmallow leaves and rose hips and coltsfoot leaves and things like that. You wouldn't be worrying about it. But it was the chemicals that were being sprayed on them, which were not appearing on the labels, that were causing the problems. The next range then was the bath salts, containing these what are called cathinones. And the basic cathinone comes again from a plant, which is one of the reasons why I'm involved in this area, because this was my specialist area. It's a plant that grows along the Red Sea in Ethiopia and in Somalia and Kenya, in East Africa. And it's the cat plant. And it contains a natural form of amphetamine called cathinone. But these are synthetic versions of cathinone. Some of them are chemically related to ecstasy. For example, methylone, which is a first cousin of MDMA, which is the chemical name for ecstasy. So many of these have ecstasy-like effects. Others, like mephedrone, and even still I read in various newspapers people mixing mephedrone up with methadone used in the treatment of heroin addiction. And I said to myself, whoever wrote that article didn't know what they were talking about. The same way in this country, when I hear people talking about Class A drugs, I say they don't know what they're talking about, because Class A, B, and C is a British construct. And I heard the minister yesterday talking about Class A drugs, and I said, does he know what he's talking about? I won't go there just yet. Okay. They come in various forms. Obviously, the synthetic cannabinoids are herbal-like materials, like herbal cannabis. Some of them are powders sold in sachets. Some of them are capsules. Some of them, for example, the blotter trips over on the far left, these are what are called N-bombs. The chemical name is NBOME, so N-bombs, and with the smiley emoticon. Some of them are very amateurishly made tablets, like the spotted cherries that killed 18 people in Northern Ireland in the space of 6 months. And the other one is the one with the Superman logo that's sold as ecstasy, but actually contains a different drug called PMMA, which is the drug that killed 2 young people in Kinsale a couple of years ago. And as with any drug, that's the most serious risk you have to talk about, is the deaths linked to new psychoactive substances. With the synthetic cannabinoids, you don't get that many deaths because, as Kevin pointed out, you don't get the cannabis receptors in the brainstem, which is the part of the brain which is usually triggered with fatal overdoses. But you can see the toll of these research chemicals, not for human consumption. Various ones, I don't think there's any that doesn't or hasn't caused death. And you can see the numbers where we have them for deaths from Ireland. In addition, there are physical complications. For example, with Mexi or methoxetamine, it causes bladder damage, severe ulceration of the bladder, even though it was marketed over the internet by head shops as a bladder-friendly alternative to the very popular club drug called ketamine, where ketamine was a human anesthetic, which is now banned basically for human use because of the near-death experience, the out-of-body experience that people encounter when they use it. But it was notorious for causing bladder ulceration. And I felt it was just more disinformation from this industry to marketed as being bladder friendly when the evidence was the fact that it was just as damaging as ketamine. Some of the others wouldn't be surprising. For example, PMMA and mephedrone, the risk of heat stroke, hyperthermia is the same. And with PMMA, it's actually higher than you get with genuine ecstasy. There's some talk about, and Kevin mentioned about, the Garda Commissioner talked about the level of aggression and violence associated with the drug scene at the present time. That was, her experience and that of her officers was worth noting because of the change in the situation. And I think it's down to a lot of the psychiatric complications that occur with these new psychoactive substances. The psychotic reactions, the paranoid reactions. I think the phrase that's used sometimes is this excited delirium, and the self-harm and the self-mutilation that is reported with, again, virtually all of this group of compounds. Even though they're different pharmacologically, they all seem to have this aggressive agitation, violent connotation with them. A lot of them are stimulants, so not surprisingly, as with, for example, crystal meth and with cocaine, you're going to get, as you force the body to work harder and harder with a stimulant, you're going to get effects on the heart. You're going to get palpitations, you're going to get chest pains, you're going to get heart attacks, you're going to get strokes. And so one of the first times we realized that there was a problem with synthetic cannabis products was young people presenting to A&E with heart problems. And they couldn't understand why they were developing these heart problems until forensic detective work discovered that the products they were smoking were laced with these chemicals. With mephedrone down at the very bottom, in addition to the stimulant effect that obviously people like, and that's the problem, is that Kevin said the human brain, the reward center in the brain, likes being tickled with these chemicals. But you also get another effect where the blood vessels are squeezed down or narrowed down, vasoconstriction. And that's a particular concern when these drugs are injected. Now, for most people, for example, the cannabinoids, the herbal smoking mixtures, they're obviously smoked. Others, they are usually taken by mouth, sometimes wrapped in Ritzel papers and bombed, just wrapped in the papers and swallowed. Or they're snorted in the same way as cocaine would be snorted. But some of these are being injected by traditional opiate users. And Ireland was the first country in the world to report the injection of mephedrone way back in 2009. A whole cohort of traditional injectors in the inner city injecting mephedrone, injecting 5 to 6 bags of mephedrone powder a day. Other countries have followed us since. There's also injecting of NDPV, and more recently, the injection of this newer cathinone called PVP, or alpha PVP. And one of the situations in Dublin, both the Gardaí and the HSE are reporting, is people are injecting up to 15 times a day because of the short-lived effects of these. And because they're injecting more frequently, they're more likely to convert to HIV. So there's been a spike, if you pardon the pun, in the transmission of HIV in Dublin linked to the injection of PVP. Now, I said earlier that most of these drugs come from China, but this is taken from the Irish Times December last year, where the Gardaí in the southeast raided a number of laboratories where, and you probably can't read it because it's a bit small, said the men in custody are suspected of manufacturing and trafficking MDPV. Manufacturing MDPV here. The same gang members are also suspected of producing and distributing phenazepam, and zopiclone. Now, zopiclone, if you don't recognize it, is Zimovane or Zimos. And God knows we have enough problem with prescribed Zimovane being abused without black market Zimovane being produced in backstreet laboratories with no quality control appearing on the market. Phenazepam is one of a number of what we call designer benzos. And God knows we have enough trouble with benzos as it is without this phenazepam, which is confusingly called Bonsai supersleep, appearing on the black market, home produced, not coming from China or from India, but from the southeast. Now, this was a designer benzo originally developed in Russia. It's basically one of the few original drugs produced in Russia. It's not used medically in any EU member state. So any phenazepam that appears on the market is illicitly produced. The claim is that it's 5 times stronger than diazepam, which is the chemical name for Valium. Now, whether that's true or not, it's very difficult to establish. But what we do know is that because it's a benzo, it will have the same effects as Valium, as Rohypnol, as Ativan, as any of the others. You get loss of coordination and drowsiness because your brain is being slowed down. There's a risk of a fatal overdose when it's mixed with alcohol. And most of our overdose deaths involve combinations of alcohol and benzos. And it's going to impair your ability to drive. There are deaths reported where phenazepam has been detected post-mortem. And I suppose I should have made the point when I was talking about the deaths associated with new psychoactive substances. I was very careful to use the word linked, because we can't say that these drugs were causing the deaths, because there were so many other drugs in the bodies of the unfortunate people who died. Often 5 or 6 different drugs, different medicines, alcohol, and illicit drugs, as well as the new psychoactive substances. So that's why we use the word linked, or in this case, detected post-mortem. And as a benzo, it's likely to result in dependence. There are other designer benzos that appeared on the market being sold by these online head shops. These are some of them. They're all characterized by the fact that we don't know anything about them because they've never been tested in humans. The most recent one that has attracted European attention is alpha PVP, known as Flakka or Snowblow, even though Snowblow was used for some of the other cathinones earlier in the century. And as I made the point, it's being sold in Dublin for injection. It's actually controlled in Ireland. It has been for nearly 5 years. But there is an EU risk assessment to be conducted early next month to see will it be controlled right throughout the EU. The other one that's under active monitoring at the present time is an opiate called acetylfentanyl. It's a designer version of a very powerful painkiller called fentanyl, which is known as Sublimase or Durogesic, which is often used with cancer patients. But some of these designer fentanyls are about 6,000 times more powerful than heroin. So I say to people, if you think heroin is the worst thing that could hit a community, believe you me, there are worse things out there. Now, as part of the EU legislation, there's an early warning system right throughout the member states. And each year, the EU Drugs Agency, the EMCDDA, update people on the chemicals that have been reported. And in 2014, which is the last year for which we have up-to-date information, there was 101 new compounds reported at European level. And you can see the way it has escalated since 2010. Most of them were either cathinones or cannabinoids. Phenethylamines, these would be either hallucinatory drugs or stimulants because they're chemically similar to amphetamine. Heroin-like compounds and benzos. And there are now 651 online head shops. So the point I want to get across with this, like, numbers put people to sleep, is that there are constantly new chemicals appearing. There will continue to be new chemicals appearing. But you need to be concerned about them, but not frightened of them. And what I mean by that is that these drugs mimic the effects of existing drugs. And I talked about people being disempowered earlier. What people, I think, need to realize is that if you have experience of working with young people using cannabis drugs, then you have the skill set to work with young people who are using spice and bonsai range of herbal smoking mixtures. You don't need new skills. If you're used to dealing with people who use hallucinogenic drugs like magic mushrooms, then you have the skill set to deal with salvia, this herb from Mexico. It's called Mexican mint or divine mint or magic mint or Sally D, that contains one of the most powerful hallucinatory drugs known. And also the N-bombs. You have the skills. The names might be different, but you have the skills to deal with them. The same applies if you're used to dealing with people with stimulant issues, you can deal with the cathinones. If you're used to dealing with young people with ecstasy issues, you can deal with the ecstasy-like cathinones and also the party pills containing BZP. You don't need new skills. You don't need to be frightened of them. You can cope. You can intervene effectively. The same way as you're used to dealing with people with heroin issues, then MT45 or AH7921 or acetylfentanyl is not going to phase you. It shouldn't phase you. You have the skills. The same with the benzos. You have the skills. The thing to remember is that the drug names may be different, they may be weird, they may be scary, but the drug effects are not different. As somebody said to me one time when I talked about this at a CAD training day, a drug is a drug is a drug. And people have the skills to intervene, both from a prevention perspective, from a treatment perspective. You don't need new projects, you don't need new skills. You just use the existing projects, the existing skills to intervene. So how do we intervene? Well, first of all, there's the legal framework, both at EU level and at national level. At EU level, there's a council directive on information exchange which sets up the early warning system. The risk assessment, looking at both the health and social risks of these substances. And then there's the control subsequently of them at EU level. Now, no piece of legislation is perfect, and that piece of legislation needs to be revised. And the EU Commission, which has the sole power of initiative in legislation at EU level, came up with a proposal in 2013. 2013, it's still a proposal. It's going nowhere fast. Partly because what the Commission decided to do was to use an article of the Lisbon Treaty dealing with the internal market to deal with these. And the first article of Article 3 of the proposal says, new psychoactive substances shall move freely within the EU, except for commercial, industrial and research purposes. Now remember, they're being sold as research chemicals. So not surprisingly, member states went ballistic and said, this is wrong. And recently, the legal service, the Council Legal Service, said that you couldn't use the internal market provisions for this legislation. So the Luxembourg presidency has come up with a compromise using the harmonisation of criminal offences, including drug trafficking as a way of controlling these. But it's been over 2 years now since this proposal arose. I don't know when, if ever, this is going to see the light of day as legislation. Within the existing system, there's been 18 different risk assessments since 1999. And alpha PVP is due next month. But one of the things I find strange is there's been no risk assessment of any synthetic cannabinoid. And I cannot get a logical explanation as to why this is. I suspect that it's because of the small number of deaths. I suspect. I can't prove it one way or the other. But what strikes me about this is that one of the other hats I wear is I'm a member of the Advisory Committee on Human Medicines, the Health Products Agency, which used to be the Irish Medicines Board. And in that context, if a medicine, a life-saving medicine, is found to have even a suspicion of causing deaths, it's removed from the market. Even 1 or 2 deaths, it's removed from the market. And for example, there's a drug called fenfluramine, which is used as a slimming agent, which is chemically related to the cathinones. It was suspected, not proven, suspected of causing damage to the valves in the heart, and it was removed from the market. Just on suspicion of an unacceptable side effect. So I think this may be the situation. But my view is, and it's one of the criticisms of the legislation, is that you shouldn't have to wait until people die before you intervene. You should be proactive, not reactive. The national framework, we have the Misuse of Drugs Act from 1977 to 2015, which lists most of these NPS as controlled substances, which makes it illegal to possess them, supply them, produce them, import them, or manufacture them. And one of the best pieces of legislation any government ever brought in this country, the Psychoactive Substances Act 2010. I think it was a phenomenal piece of legislation because it resulted in the closing down of the bricks and mortar head shops. I think there's about 3 of them still open, and from what I can gather, they're not offering to supply any substances. And I think it's really successful. It's successful from the point of view of what it was aimed to do, was to close down the head shops. But it also had another effect. And this is a paper by Bobby Smith and Philip James, who'll talk to you this afternoon, where they looked at the impact of that headshop ban on their clients in the youth drug and alcohol service in Tallow. You can see that pre the ban, 82% of their clients said that they used new psychoactive substances. After the ban, that had dropped to 28%. And under the various categories, you can see the way it's dropped. And there was a very telling final sentence in that paper from Bobby Smith and Philip James. It says, "Our findings do not provide a rationale for Ireland to alter its prohibitionist approach to NPS at this time." Now, what some people might call prohibition, I call creating a level playing field for consumer chemicals. Because if I'm a manufacturer of a medicine or an agrochemical or a food additive or even a hair dye, the onus under EU law is that I have to prove that my product is safe. I have to do a range of tests to prove that my product does not cause cancer, does not cause reproductive abnormalities, does not poison people. I have to do that. There is no onus on the state to prove that the product is harmful. And in my view, the same should apply to new psychoactive substances. And my view, quite simple, maybe too simple, is that if you can't show that these products are safe, they cannot be allowed on the market. And frankly, I do not believe that these products can be shown to be safe. I was fascinated 2 years ago in a discussion with the New Zealand Minister for Health where they brought in a legal market for new psychoactive substances. And they said that the manufacturers had to prove that their products were safe. But he stood up and he said, we are not going to allow any animal testing. And I said, well, that's fine. I can understand you do not want to subject animals to unnecessary cruelty. But I said, you cannot prove reproductive safety without testing through 3 generations of animals. It's the only way you can avoid another thalidomide disaster is to do that. And if you're not doing animal testing, you cannot say to women that of childbearing age that these products are safe. So as far as I'm concerned, if you can't show something is safe, you do not allow it on the market. Now, I'm not naive enough. I've been involved in these things for far too long. Supply reduction is only part of the answer. We also have to tackle demand reduction through information and education, and they're not the same thing. Education is what you do with the information. We need to reduce the risk factors for young people getting involved with NPS and other drugs. We need to strengthen and reinforce the protective factors that we know of. This is reinventing the wheel. This is not new stuff. This goes back years. But we need to involve the whole community. Now, the NACD, one of the last things I was involved with in the NACD was this early school leaving study, where we looked at drug use in a group of early school leavers and a matched group of young people still at school living in exactly the same areas as the youngsters who had left school. And we identified certain risk factors. Substance use by other family members. In other words, the clear lesson for parents, myself included, is it has to be do as I do, not do as I say. Friends who use drugs, the need for a positive peer group. We need to recognize that the 2 legal drugs, alcohol and tobacco, are the clear gateway drugs. And we also need to recognize that low self-esteem is a risk factor, and all that we can do to build up young people so that they realize that they don't need chemicals to enjoy themselves. We also recognize certain positive protective factors, parental involvement and concern. Now, most parents are involved and concerned about their teenage son and daughter's lives, but it's actually young people themselves knowing and perceiving that their parents were involved and concerned seem to be the protective factor. Information on substance use for parents. And this is where what CAD does is so important. This is why I am a fan of what CAD does, because of this. Friends who don't use drugs and a positive school experience. And one of the things I've involved with as a spin-off from a CAD training day is with a mental health charity called Headstrong, where they're piloting a program in schools in Meath and in the Blanchardstown area on cannabis and mental health, trying to create a positive school experience and the importance of what they call one good teacher who will link with young people as part of that process. Now, sometimes we expect schools to do everything. They need to do sex education, bullying, cyberbullying, drugs. You know, the school can't operate in a vacuum. Families can't operate in a vacuum. There has to be a consistent backup from parents, a consistent backup from the community. Because particularly community attitudes can and do undermine the demand reduction activities of both parents and schools. We need to tackle what's called the culture of intoxication, the glorification of intoxication, whether that's intoxication with alcohol, whether it's with ecstasy, whether it's with cannabis, whether it's with new psychoactive substances. Glorying, getting stoned, getting out of your face, out of your tree. And if we don't do that, then we're condemning generation after generation to misery. That's the blunt message. We need to change our attitudes, particularly to alcohol. Now, young people are right when they accuse us as adults of being hypocritical when it comes to alcohol. They are right. But equally, we need to challenge their hypocrisy when it comes to the environment. They are a generation that puts us to shame with their environmental concern for the planet. But they don't seem to be concerned about the most important environment of the whole lot, the environment of the human brain, this wonderful mechanism that we call the human brain. And they're quite happy to load any chemical that if a pharmaceutical company was pumping it into the atmosphere, they'd be agitating to close that pharmaceutical company down, quite rightly, to close it down. The other irony about young people and drugs is they overwhelmingly want to be free. They want to be independent of us as adults. But if you get involved with drugs, whether they're new psychoactive substances or other drugs, then the risk is becoming drug dependent. You are no longer independent. You are no longer free. The drug owns you body and soul. And that to me is the confidence trick that the chemical message is promoting. Finally, a question for you as we face into drawing up a new drug strategy. Would this country be a happier, healthier, safer, wealthier place if these several hundred NPS plus all the other drugs were made more available? My answer is a resounding no. What's your answer? Thank you very much.